Kia ora, everyone. My name is Marlies, and I'm also excited to be here, even though it's quite late in New Zealand where I'm at. So I'm doing my PhD in human animal studies at the New Zealand Centre for Human Animal Studies. So the talk I'm presenting tonight or today will focus mainly on commodification processes and care work involved in responsible dog breeding practices. So this is part of my PhD projects, which examines the legitimation of pedigree dog breeding through a responsible breeding discourse in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So this is a bit of an overview of my presentation. I will start off with giving you a bit of background about my methodology that I've used for my project and also the participants of my research. Then I'll discuss a little bit of scholarship that I want to use for this analysis on capitalism and dog breeding. I also want to shortly introduce the concept of breed love I want to work around in my thesis. And lastly, I'll give some preliminary findings of the interviews I've done, which will still be, excuse me, very descriptive. So I welcome any suggestions from you. So first of all, the methodology I've used was a species-inclusive sensory ethnography, which included mainly conversational style interviews with responsible breeders in the presence of their dogs, combined with some observations. I also made use of pictures, so I asked breeders for pictures of their dogs, and I also took pictures myself when I visited the dog breeders. Some of these pictures will be included in the slides. For now, I have chosen to edit them because I have been thinking about also protecting the confidentiality of the dogs who participated. And I've been lucky that I have a friend, a photographer, Shannon Johnstone, who have helped me edit them. So this is still something I'm working with and thinking through. So I also welcome any feedback or suggestions on that front. So for my project, I did 13 interviews in total with 14 responsible breeders. 13 of those were New Zealand, were accredited breeders by the New Zealand Kennel Club. And one breeder was used to be part of that accredited breeder scheme. And interestingly, 13 of my participants were also women. And there were also about 103 dogs who participated in my research, which included puppies that were present sometimes, and also one cat. I included here a short overview of the color coding I've used in my transcripts because I will share some quotes from the interviews later on. So you have an idea what the color stands for, because I really wanted to include some of the emotions, feelings that were expressed in the interviews, as well as things related to the dogs. So things that were happening in the background, dogs barking and such, as well as some of the ways the breeders were talking. Yeah, so this is a bit of an overview of the way I transcribed. I also do not include any specific breeds in my quotes, because to really ensure anonymity of my participants, because some of the breeders, for some of the breeds, there was only one breeder, accredited breeder in New Zealand of that particular breed. Now, why do I look at responsible breeding within a capitalist framework? So as many different critical animal studies scholars have already highlighted and examined the role of the capitalist political economy in shaping human-animal relationships and non-human animal exploitation. Many of them have extended Marx's work on capitalism to non-human animals, mainly done in animal agriculture, aiming to recognize non-human animals' labor and criticizing their commodification and property status. For instance, Bob Torres has argued that in our current capitalist system, quote unquote, capital has literally imprinted itself upon the bodies of animals through selective breeding, which has changed the bodies of non-human animals to make them better commodities. I also particularly want to use some of the Marxist feminist framework because they have been visibilizing women's care and reproductive work that has been devalued in the capitalist system and considering it politically important to include it in the anti-capitalist struggle. Some critical and feminist animal studies scholars have also extended this feminist critique on capitalism by examining in particular the ways female animal bodies are exploited for their reproductive capabilities and the care work that they do. This has again been mainly done on farm animals and less so on animals we consider our pets, even though there is also exploitation of female breeding dogs' reproductive bodies, for instance, and their care work, I argue, to satisfy human demands for pet dogs and the continuation of the breeds people love. So before I turn to my findings, I want to introduce a concept I'm working around in my thesis, which I call breed love. So this concept has in part been influenced by Donna Haraway's When Species Meet, where she talks about how she was critical of pedigree dog breeds at first, calling dog breeds, quote unquote, an embodiment of animalizing racist eugenics. However, she changed her view after she so-called fell in love with the Australian Shepherd dog breed and argued that one can practice, quote unquote, love of the breed through responsible genetics. And I found that after talking to 14 responsible pedigree dog breeders in Aotearoa, New Zealand for my PhD project, that such a narrative of love for the breed has really been central to their practices. And this love seems to motivate them to breed, to save their breed and improve them from the health issues they face, even that they don't really earn much profits of their dogs. So breed love, I think, can be an interesting frame that encompasses the complexities of these relationships between breeders and their dogs, and that there's tension between breeders loving their dogs as individuals, as family members, but also loving them as a human-centric construct that they embody, namely the breeds, which makes them valuable commodities. So because responsible breeders are driven by the love for the breed, they consider their breeding practices more like a hobby or passion rather than a business. However, their pedigree dogs are still considered pets, and properties, so they will still sell their puppies as commodities on the pet market, which I want to focus now in some of the findings. So first way commodification processes are present in responsible breeding is basically how pedigree puppies are assigned monetary value on the pet markets. So most of the breeders I talk to, they will set their price for their puppies based on what they call the market price, as this breeder Iris talks about, for instance. So she says we look at the market, what the market is doing. But how high an appropriate price is for a puppy also differs according to the breed of the dog. So breeders have told me that they've asked prices for the puppies that range from 1,500 New Zealand dollars to over 4,000 New Zealand dollars, which really shows that breed categorization influences the commodification of pedigree puppies, making some pedigree breeds more valuable than others in the pet market, which has nothing to do with their intrinsic value. And breeders such as Liam in the next quote, he also feels like health-tested pedigree dogs should actually be worth more than one that's not health-tested. As you can see in this quote where he talks that prices for me, he says, the price of pedigree dogs that are health-tested should be more than a backyard breed dog. For the simple fact that you're buying a guarantee, like we actually sell our dogs with genetic fault guarantee, because we test for all genetic faults so we can give back a guarantee. So here even Pedigree's dog supposedly health status should also make them worth more on the pet market, according to this breeder. So the value of a pedigree dog breed also seems linked to pedigree dog's use value, or what I call pet value. So the responsible breeders talks about matching breeds with their pet dog consumers. And they really emphasize the variety of dogs created by every breed's supposedly unique, predictable characteristics, ensuring that, according to them, there's a dog that, quote unquote, perfect match for every pet consumer specific lifestyle. As Carol, for instance, talks about in this quote, she says, but as far as why pedigree dogs were bred in the first place and what the difference is with all of them, I think that's precious. I think that's a really good thing. And reliability and predictability is what we want. If you want a family pet and you want to go running every day, you can get something like, well, you could get anything from a terrier breed because they're busy dogs with permanent energy to, a working breed. You wouldn't get a non-sporting breed. non-sporting breeds would not go running with you every day. So this is really indicating how, according to, and how the breed status makes pedigree dogs valuable commodities in the pet market by really providing a diverse supply of pet dogs that, according to breeders, will suit the different needs of different pet consumers. So it's also that these unique characteristics that every breed has that at the same time makes some breeds more fit for mass market consumption than others. So some breeds are considered quote unquote everyone's dog. So a breed that is very popular and supposedly loved by many because of their typical breed characteristics that make them quote unquote an ideal pet who can fit any type of consumer. As Carol, for instance, talks about her breed. So in this quote, she says that her dog breed, they're everybody's dog. They're so adaptable. They will fit with anyone's lifestyle because they live to please and they love company. So if I worked in an office and my gun dog breed sat under the desk for 8 hours a day, they would be happy. Much happier than if it was left in a $10,000 kennel by itself, They just want to be with you. And so it doesn't matter whether you're a white van man or a single mom or, a retired couple or a tramper or a farmer, that dog is going to fit your lifestyle. While other dog breeds are, quote unquote, aren't everyone's cup of tea and are more fit for a niche market, as this breeder Donna mentions when talking about her breed. So here she says that her dog breed, they're feisty and independent. They're not a gun dog breed. You can train them to be a gun dog breed. That's not what they are. And that means they will never be suitable for a mass market, and they'll never be thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of my terrier breeds. But according to her, in the right situation, they're fabulous dogs. So this is already showing a bit how logics of supply and demand, because of human-centric ideas about a breed, play a role in responsible breeding. So lastly, I want to talk also a bit about the gendered care and reproductive labor involved in breeding pedigree dogs. So mainly female dog bodies are intensively involved in the reproductive and care labor of producing pedigree puppies who are commodified on the pet market. So female dogs are going through an entire pregnancy, and they do care work for their puppies for 8 to 12 weeks usually. And sometimes they're also even transported across the country for breeding purposes, as this breeder Donna talks about. So in this quote, she says, Cynthia, who has offered her on lease to have a litter, but I'm going to have to do more health testing for her. I haven't got the money at the moment to do it, as well as she also lives in another region in New Zealand. So I have to go get her from that region, do the health testing, do the artificial insemination, and then she goes back to that region in New Zealand. Then get her back for whelping and so on. The cost is prohibitive. And also because I live on my own, I need someone to look after the puppies when I'm at work. So I've been doing it with a combination of house sitters and woofers, but it relies on having people who are available or willing to sit. So as the second part of this quote also indicates is that care work involved is also shared with human breeders. The breeders I talk to usually spend day and night caring for puppies and mom, or sometimes like Donna, they will later on hire people to help out with caring for the puppies and the mom when they have to go to work. So because responsible breeders breed out of breed love and not for profit, they are willing to put a lot of unpaid labor and other costs into producing pedigree puppies that is not reflected in that market price. But this still doesn't account, I argue, for the care and reproductive labor done by dogs themselves. And as Kendra Coulter, for instance, has argued for farm animals, I similarly want to argue that these processes of production of puppies and the care work involved are not done for the dog's own species-specific reasons, but so that puppies can be transformed into commodities for human use. So they get to provide care work to their puppies just because it is deemed important for the puppy socialization to become a reliable pet for their future owners. So even though responsible breeders that I talk to don't really breed for profit and they care for their breeding dogs, they are still controlling and exploiting their dogs' bodies because they want to see the breed they love continued. So this is something I want to look more into in further analysis, so I welcome any suggestions. And that's it for me. Thank you for listening.
My name is Zoei Sutton. I'm a researcher at Flinders University, and I'm a sociologist who does a lot of multi-species research, but primarily my focus has been on pets for about the last 10 years. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about something that I kind of grapple with when I work on different projects with animals who are being used for companionship. And it's this sort of tension that I see between pursuing kind of animal liberation as total liberation futures while trying to maintain a sort of ethic of care around animals who are being used as companions and advocating for people to care for animals who are subjects of a life while not then leaning into the liveliness and the beauty around animals that makes them so commodifiable as pets as well. So it's a little bit messy, but I'm hoping that I can kind of muddle through some ideas and maybe see what other folks think as well and see how other people are navigating this, because it's something I come up against a lot as we will get into in this talk. I won't head myself off. So what I'm going to talk through is firstly the social construction of animals as pet commodities. How do we tend to talk about animals who are used as pets in sociology? And how do we tend to reinscribe them as kind of these familial loving relationships that obscures a lot of the exploitation inherent in them? I'm going to talk a bit about the pet industrial complex and how pets are situated in the broader kind of animal industrial complex that we talk about a lot, but often focused on farmed animals who are killed for meat and other commodities. And then I'm going to talk about the complexities of caring for animals in this context. And a quick note on language, I use the word pet throughout my presentation, which I know is kind of a subject of much debate in the fields around companion animal research. And the reason that I use the word pet is that when I go back to Joan Denea, who talks a lot about speciesism in language and the way that we cover up a lot of exploitation without nice use of language, I think about the preferred terms like animal companion and companion animal if you're in the mainstream and you've not yet made it to animal companion. And I think about the animals who I work with when I'm doing this kind of research and the animals who I worked with when I worked in pet industries before I became a sociologist. And when Joan Denea talks about the way that we use language around animals used for companionship, she kind of says, you know, if an animal is like co-living with a human and they're treated with the full respect, then animal companion would be an appropriate term to use. But when I look at the pet industry and I look at the animals whose lives I'm talking about today, I don't see animals who are being treated with the full respect. And I think a lot of the time we use the word animal companion in a way that covers up some of the exploitation in these relationships. Hence, you're going to see a lot of pet, and we're going to think about the uncomfortableness of that word pet, but also that that uncomfortableness is probably about practices that are still going, not just about the language that's being used. Okay, so socio-material construction of animals as pet commodities, which is quite a mouthful. When we look at the construction of different animals, from a sociological perspective, I lean a lot on Erica Cudworth, who talks about the anthroparchal system that shapes pretty much all of our relationships with animals in our social world. And an anthroparchal system is one where human wants and needs are consistently privileged over the wants and needs of other animals and of the natural environment. And this is something that filters not just into our everyday relationships, but in our social structures, in our policies, and our practices, and anything that we can imagine for our multi-species shared world. And I also think a lot about the way that non-human animals are physically and socially constructed according to how useful or disuseful they are to humans. And we think about this a lot with animals who are used for food, but I think sometimes when we look at pets, we don't necessarily focus as much on how much they are socially constructed, just like everything else. And I see this in narratives around the picture, actually the picture that I deleted from this slide, was one of those ones that we see in a lot of campaigns where you have a picture of a dog and a picture of a pig, and it says something like, why eat one and love the other? And I always look at that and think about how, in an Australian context at least, we do love dogs, but we also test on them in a bunch of medical facilities. And we love cats as pets, but we also have a massive feral cat campaign where we literally pay people to kill free-living cats and sometimes bring in parts of their bodies as trophies. We literally put out campaigns around releasing myxomatosis into the environment to kill free-living rabbits, and we'll send letters to people who keep rabbits as pets to say, oh, we want to keep your rabbits safe because we really love these ones, but not those ones. So I think instead of focusing on something like species when we look at pets, it's a lot more useful to look at pet as a category that animals are socially and physically constructed into. It's something that's done to animals in the same way that we construct animals as pests or meat or wild or other things like that. And we can also think about pets as lively commodities for following Rosemary Claire Collard. And lively commodities, Collard argues, are animals who are sold for their liveliness. So we don't consume pets in the same way that we consume the flesh from animals' bodies. When we consume pets, what we want is a lively commodity, an animal who is lively, so they are animated and they're affectionate and they can play with you and they can do all of those things to facilitate that entertainment and companionship function that we expect pets to play. But they're not fully alive, so that we don't want to think about their needs and their wants and actually center them in their lives and what their lives are like in the way that we construct them for them. So it's a really important distinction between lively commodities and actually alive beings who are subjects of a life. We also think about pet animals as super exploited commodities. So while pets are consumed as lively commodities, they fulfill that companionship function. And if they don't, they can be unmade as pets and sent to an animal shelter or otherwise killed. Super exploited commodities are, as Marlies was just talking about, we don't just have pets who live in our houses, we also have pets and then force them to procreate to create more pets so that we can sell their children and profit off of their bodies and their labor and continue to have this lively commodity trade regardless of the emotional and physical fallout for the animals involved in it. Which all sounds pretty bleak. So why do we still have pets and why don't we think more critically about them? Because we have what Yifu Tuan calls a veil of affection. So we place a really kind of clear socially constructed veil between all of these practices that uphold the pet industry that enable us to keep animals for companionship in our house. And on the other side, we have all of the narratives around love and family and things that make it sound really nice that we focus on. And this is what Erica Fudge calls a dual contradictory narrative that upholds the pet industry. So when we think about legitimating pet keeping as a practice, we have this one narrative that, you know, pets really love us and they would choose to live with us. So it's okay for us to go and buy an animal and use them as a pet because if they had a choice, they would want to live in our house and they would want to be loved by us. Which raises the question that if animals have this emotional capacity, if they do love us and they want to be here, presumably they also loved their familial bonds they had before. They loved the other animals that they were interacting with before. And if we believe that animals can have that emotional capacity and love, then how can we justify forcibly breeding them and selling their offspring for our profit? But we also have a narrative around, you know, we don't really need to worry about that because animals are just creatures of instinct. It's their instinct to submit to humans and to be owned. So they don't really mind when we sell their children. But that then raises the question that if we really think that's true, why do we keep these creatures who we really believe can't love us and construct all these narratives of love around these relationships? So it's a little bit of smoke and mirrors that upholds the pet industry that we can unpack a little bit more. When we look at sociological articles, the broad span of sociological articles tend to be very human-centric and they're very depoliticized. So more than any other articles about non-human animals, articles about pets are the least likely to actually challenge the positioning of animals for use of companionship. We have that emphasis on companion animals as family and friends and lifesavers and life changers. And this has really created kind of a brick wall around a lot of companion animal research. It's made it really difficult to do what we would call critical pet studies up to date. And this is partially because when you look at pets in research, you have to deal with human gatekeepers. So you're working with animal owners who self-select into research. They tell you everything's fine. A lot of research isn't species inclusive that brings pets in. And also when you're trying to talk about pets in this critical way in animal liberation discussions, you have to negotiate with other humans. And I always remember that we are the oppressive species, which means that sometimes we just decide that oppressions aren't that bad. And I think something that we need to do, and the reason that I wanted to talk about this particular topic, is to keep reminding ourselves that companion animals are not the best case scenario for animals in our liberated future. Actually, we've just decided that this is a good relationship because we're really emotionally invested in it. And I think we need to make sure that as we continue to have discussions about moving past animal oppression, we don't fall into that trap of legitimating this kind of exploitation in everyday life that then upholds a whole range of other exploitations, let alone the kind of consequences for people who are the animals that are in them now. Okay, so there's a bunch of critical work being done, which is great. Some sociologists are highlighting that pets are caught up in the same oppression of other animals. These relationships are unavoidably underpinned by domination. This domination leaves animals vulnerable to physical and emotional abuse on top of the exploitation they're already experiencing and their lack of freedom around movement and their ability to control their own lives. But often these critiques aren't brought into conversation with empirical work, which is why Marlies' work is very exciting. And they're not always explored in detail. So we don't have a lot of empirical work to work with at the moment, which is slowly changing. And overall, this just this isn't an individual issue. So often we focus on individual abuses when we look at pets, individual kind of case studies like puppy farms and things like that. This isn't sort of a case-specific, very small thing where bad people do bad things to animals or very small parts of the pet industry are bad. This is a systemic issue that actually reflects this really complex interconnection of capitalist interests and anthropocal structures and intersecting human inequalities as well that shape our shared social life and make it really difficult to challenge these kinds of everyday, often hidden in plain sight inequalities that we participate in. Okay, so what is the pet industrial complex? This is a term that I haven't seen used very widely, but I have seen people who write about the animal industrial complex, where we're looking at kind of animal industries as embedded in a capitalistic framework between things like industry, different services, government organizations, and a whole range of practices and social and political forces in society. When we look at the animal industrial complex, people like Richard Twine have argued that, pets very much fit within this. We see them in kind of the entertainment industrial complex. We see them fitting in a bunch of different ways in the broader animal industrial complex that oppresses non-human animals for things like food and agriculture. Pets are very much kind of implicated in the amount of animals who are killed to prop up the pet industry. So there are 6.6 billion chickens who are killed for pet food around the world every year, and also the use of animal bodies for other animal goods. But I just thought it would be interesting to start having a look at how many different forces are kind of implicated in the pet industry in an Australian context, which starts to give us a sense of why it is so difficult to make challenging arguments around pets. And this seems to be an area that's really difficult to push back on. We have a few Facebook groups in Australia where you start to see things kick off every so often. You probably have this in your own countries. And one of the things that I see that really blows up is when someone starts talking about getting an animal from a breeder or feeling entitled to a particular breed and kind of justifying that, I would really love an animal, or, I'll be a good dog owner, but I can only have a Labradoodle because they're hypoallergenic. So that's fine. And it's still vegan and no one needs to really criticize this. And when that gets challenged, people get really, really offended in ways that I don't see them get offended about other animal issues in our vegan groups. And this kind of tells me that even though companion animals are in plain sight, it's actually this sort of unchallengeable thing that we really need to critique a little bit more. And in some ways, I would say because they're in plain sight, because we have this normalized exploitation of animals, it's actually one of the things that we need to challenge quite prominently because it's propping up a whole lot of other beliefs. And it's this sort of normalized everyday practice of anthropocal norms. Anyway, so in Australia, we have basically a $10.7 billion industry that's very implicated in pet ownership. 3.7 billion of that is pets and pet services. Only a very small amount of our pet industry is actually the costing of animals. A lot of it is this really heavy industry we have around accessories and food and getting things that look like sushi so your dog can play with them and getting dog photographs made and a whole lot of other things that make you have your animal look really cute and presentable and really preserve that kind of commodity fetishism we have around companion animals. Things like vet services have obviously taken off, vet pharmaceuticals, vet lab testing. But I think there's also a whole range of uncounted services that feed into the pet industrial complex. And this is part of where we see this kind of filtering out of human-pet relationships that makes it even more difficult to challenge. So we've got a whole bunch of services that profit from animal likenesses. People who will like take your dog's picture and put them on a jumper and things like that, which has seen it spread into not just dog clothing, but also different clothing companies who will put your cat on a sweatshirt and other places that wouldn't necessarily have any kind of stake in the pet industry, except they now have because we profit from animal likenesses a whole lot of the time in ways that don't benefit them in any way. We have neoliberal university researchers like me who make their job researching non-human animals and probably need to think really carefully about what it means that our jobs and our career and our livelihood is very much invested in the way that we use animals in society, which for some of us, we would be very happy to be out of a job because animal exploitation was gone. But for others, I've had people ask me at Consequences, don't you worry that you would be out of a job if we had no pets in the future? And I was really surprised because I thought we were all working towards a future where we'd be out of a job on those grounds and that would be a good thing. Perhaps not. But we have like pet-centric media content. We have so many TV shows about placing animals, training animals, using animals in different ways that all legitimate pet keeping. And if pet keeping was challenged, all of that is a multi-billion-dollar industry that would come down with it. We have tangential business initiatives. So increasingly, I see businesses using pets in a way that boosts their own profits. They're offering free puppuccinos to get humans to come in to buy their services. Having a dogs at the pub day, which in Australia, dogs often aren't allowed in the pub, which means that having a dogs at the pub day means people are more likely to come in. And all of this is slowly increasing the tendrils of normalizing pet keeping in public, bringing it into more fields, and also meaning that more businesses are invested in the pet industry than otherwise would have been before. We have a whole industry around policy development. We have pet food, not just as the beneficiary of animals who are killed and the profit around making pet food, which it definitely is, but we have other industries who use the pet food as an output for killable animals who are otherwise unfit for human consumption. So animals like horses who are not able to be eaten by humans in a lot of circumstances can be put in places like pet food a lot of the time. And that means we have another industry who is kind of implicated in the pet industry, even though it seems like they might have no stock in it, but they need it not just for profit, but also for a particular output for some kind of waste management that they otherwise wouldn't have. And as Marlies was saying, pets also provide a whole lot of unpaid labor. So increasingly, I'm seeing a lot of One Health arguments around how good pets are and how pets should be prescribed for human gain and a whole range of other things. And this is really just creating a whole lot of other human services who are really implicated in keeping pets as something that exists in society, and increasingly sort of using pets as a way to not have to spend money on human services, which are very much needed. And we have a whole lot of intersectional arguments around One Health and why humans and animals should be considered as sort of one and the same when we need to look at intersectional health problems and social problems and things like that. But I would say an inappropriate use of the One Health model is how much we've leaned into prescribing pet kind of arguments, that we should prescribe pets for loneliness. We should prescribe pets in a pandemic. We should get animals to be doing this unpaid labor because this is a nice way that we can meet human needs. And we don't necessarily need to think about animals' needs, or maybe the taxing nature of providing emotional, sensory, physical, and mental support for humans all the time, because we can be a needy bunch. Okay. Lucia, do chime in and tell me if I'm talking too long, because I never know. The complexities.
You are talking too long.
Am I? Am I finished?
Yeah.
All right, I'll finish.
Yeah, you can finish. You can finish.
Okay.
Yeah, the last slide. You go.
Okay, I'm almost done. So the reason that I wanted to think through complexities of care is because I think a lot about all of these industries who are intertwined in the pet industrial complex, and the way that we have a kind of revolving door around animals who are made and unmade as pets, which kind of brings in discussions around, like, animal shelters who need to rehome animals often have to leave into these commodification arguments to reinscribe animals as pets to get them into a home, which is better for them than slowly kind of suffering in an animal shelter that is doing their best but isn't necessarily built up to be a home. So we have all of these different kinds of complexities around wanting to dismantle pet keeping, but also knowing that companion animals are alive for their commodity life. We need to care for those who already exist. And that means feeding into commodification a lot of the time, building industries of care, which are then sort of vested interests in the pet keeping. And promoting care for non-human species can then feed into a kind of fetishization. So my animals are bully crosses, and we have a lot of bully stigma in Australia. And I think a lot about wanting to normalize that they are subjects of a life, that they're caring creatures. They're not inherently scary. That's a human construct. But I don't want to fetishize them so that everyone all of a sudden starts breeding a lot of bully breeds and they want to have a lot of them. And it's a really difficult line, I think, to grow a lot. And when I was looking at these pet industries, I found this quote about how ongoing pet humanization was driving revenue growth. And it just made me feel gross and feel that real tension between creating value around animals so that people can see the value of animals, but not then leading into that kind of feeding into their thing. And this is my last slide. So I was thinking through whether we can care for animal companions and still fight for liberation. And I like to think we can, otherwise my work's very redundant and I need to pack up and go home. But I do think we need to think really carefully about things like the importance of framing. So foregrounding liberation, or foregrounding that pet keeping doesn't exist in a liberated society. And in the meantime, this is what we're talking about, rather than just talking about welfare without that framing. Maybe thinking about the separation of money from non-human animals when we talk about adoption, and some of that Zeltzer sociology of money stuff around how we might do that in ways that don't reinscribe them as goods all of the time. And for the most part, just kind of leaning into setting expectations for co-constructing space, for respecting animals as subjects of a life, for resisting profiting off animals wherever possible. So thinking about how we consume animal goods and likenesses of them and whether it benefits them. And again, always just reminding mindful that we are members of the oppressing species. So when we talk about decentering humans and minimizing harm, this is a constant conversation that we need to hold ourselves accountable in, rather than just a one and done because we're vegan and we've peaked and we don't need to do it anymore. So that's my ramble. If you have any thoughts, please let me know. It vexes me very much, keeps me awake at night. And thank you for your patience.
So yeah, morning everyone. Morning anyway from the UK. I'm Kerry. I'm a PhD student at the University of Exeter in the UK. I'm just about to submit my PhD, and it's been a multi-species ethnography examining the lives and experiences of some of the greyhounds leaving the racing industry in the UK. The extract I'm going to present today is actually some autoethnography, and is a piece from my fieldwork. But I've been looking at some of the greyhounds leaving the industry, and also the people who care for and about them. And a big part of my research has been looking at some of the structural and systemic issues kind of facing greyhounds, and some of the sort of socio-political issues facing activists who are trying to leverage change for this population of dogs. So I've called my talk today The Power of Passivity. So it's about resistance, but it's about those quiet acts of resistance that I've seen so many greyhounds kind of engage in. Just a short warning that I will be sharing some images of greyhounds which do depict injuries, but I haven't got anything too bloody. And just a note to mention that, unless specified, all of the photos that I use today are photos that I've taken myself or by another volunteer if I'm in the photo. And I do use pseudonyms for most of the dogs. There are some dogs that appear in some of these images that are dogs I've adopted, but mostly I use pseudonyms just to protect anonymity. Okay. So what's prompted this paper then? Well, I conducted fieldwork for my PhD, and as part of that, I volunteered on a project which assisted greyhounds injured through racing. So I volunteered at a track, and enabled those greyhounds to have swift veterinary intervention and onward rescue spaces. And as part of this project, I actually cared for 6 injured greyhounds in my kitchen at my home over a 3-year period. And some of these dogs stayed for a few days, others stayed for a few weeks or sometimes months. And one dog stayed for the best part of a year and then lived with me and the rest of my adopted greyhound family. So in this image here is a dog called Jacob, and he stayed for about a month. And I'm just going to read you an extract from my field diary, which hopefully you'll be able to see is where I started to question sort of how these dogs that were arriving from their traumatic experiences were starting to sort of navigate the conditions of the care that I was providing in my kitchen. So I'll just read this extract, and this is on a blog that I've also written, which is on the University of Exeter E's website, which I can link to at the end if anyone wants to read it. So I'm just kind of reflecting here on Jacob's experience, and I'm writing, as I gaze at Jacob, my latest foster boy with a newly repaired fractured leg, I wonder how all this is stacking up for him. He rests amid the unfamiliarity of my kitchen, seemingly passively, quietly, compliantly. Oh, maybe it's the tramadol. I hate the way it seems to slough them of their agency, removing the questions from their eyes. Because there must be questions. There are always questions. Maybe I'll begin to see them in the morning, that familiar messy mix of curiosity and apprehension that I've witnessed so often as they crash land here after their ordeal. But what do I say in response? It's okay, we've saved your life. Or maybe, I'm sorry, we've taken your life away. I'm not sure which brings the most comfort for me or for Jacob. So I guess what I'm trying to convey there is that I'm starting to recognize that, you know, I mean, as Zoe was just discussing, that care is complex, right? There's a power differential, definitely, in relation to the care that we provide. And I guess through this work with these greyhounds, I was starting to kind of untangle that a little bit. And I've just, in this image, I've just got some images of some of the other dogs that I cared for over that 3-year period. And what I would say is, you know, each of these dogs sustained a serious injury through their involvement in commercial racing. And it was imperative, really, that that we intervened in being able to help them, and in some cases saving their lives. And some required intensive wound care following a leg amputation or other deep tissue wound. Others were on limited exercise following specialist surgical repair. But, you know, what I really started to recognize was that all of these dogs were decompressing on some level following their co-option into racing. And they all arrived into my kitchen in various states of bewilderment, discombobulation, and confusion. So this is one of the chapters of my PhD. You know, I've really started to kind of be concerned with what I'm calling conundrums of care, because we so often think about care, particularly in a kind of rescue space, as being benevolent. But Girard and Holland's work on the less innocent qualities of care, where they were looking at dogs, beagles that were kind of being rescued from the medical testing industry, and also discourses around kind of how beagles were presented, was really, really interesting in helping me to kind of unpick this. And I started to become aware of the different ways that each of these dogs in my kitchen participated in and resisted aspects of their rehabilitative care. And this aspect of my PhD research really encouraged me to think about how other animals have been instrumentalized, really navigate this care. But the premise of my talk today is not really to discuss these care practices in detail, but I really want to invite, and is it like Zoe said, you know, my talk is also a little bit exploratory, and some of these are quite knotty issues, so I haven't worked everything out really yet, but I really want to invite some broader and systemic discussions about the factors that influence how other animals who are rescued from animal use industries, you know, how these animals respond in these circumstances. And in particular, and perhaps maybe a bit provocatively, I want to invite a broader consideration of animals who may quietly say no to aspects of their care, especially when this care is benevolently delivered and easily missed. So lots of scholars have written about resistance, Jason Rybel, Sarek Collin. I'm just going to draw on Katja Gunther's work here, just because her work on the lives and deaths of shelter animals maybe resonates the most with my work looking at the animals leaving the racing industry. So Gunther describes animal resistance as acts that stand in opposition to anthroparchal power and thus demand that power respond. And she goes on to note that resistance is any instance of animals refusing to comply with human expectations of their behaviour. And it need not be violent or grandiose, but it must threaten to interfere with or undermine existing relationships of domination between humans and animals. And she goes on to note resistance, examples of resistance that can be both active, like antagonistic actions such as biting or escaping, as well as passive, so refusals to participate in their care, for example, by refusing to eat or to walk. And I concur with Gunther on these descriptions, but I do think we can go a little bit further. You know, I'm interested in the kinds of things that can complicate how other animals participate in and resist conditions of their care. So, for example, what happens then if humans don't recognize these acts of resistance, these active and passive acts of resistance? What happens when resistance actually masquerades as compliance? And how have both structural and relational conditions under which we force other animals to live impacted how they resist and how they express that resistance? And also, really importantly, if animals don't appear to resist, does this mean that they consent? You know, and I've really, really seen this in the dogs that I've worked with coming out of the racing industry for reasons that I'll discuss in a second. You know, during my field work, I'm just going to give a couple of examples here, but during my field work, I encountered dogs who appeared to tolerate really excessive coercive handling, even in high stress situations. So just a couple of examples in the images here. The dog on the left had been transported in a crate in the rescue van following a suspected leg fracture, so a really serious injury. I had to literally reach in and scoop him out. I didn't have any equipment at that time. I just had to put my head in and get him out. And on the right is a dog in an emergency veterinary clinic following a suspected leg fracture sustained during a race. And you can see from this image that he isn't weight bearing. So, you know, there was a serious injury sustained here. You know, neither of these dogs were known to me beforehand, and I had to excessively handle them in order to care for them. Both accepted my intrusive handling passively, but can we concur that this meant that they offered their permission for my acts of care? And okay, we might say in the previous examples, there might be some sort of physiological kind of reasoning for that. You know, in times of stress, we all, you know, our systems shut down. They may have been in a state of freeze, for example. So we could say, well, that could account for why these animals were passively accepting my coercive handling. But I would like to invite broader consideration of some of these issues because I've seen them in other settings. You know, and in particular, I'd like to encourage an extension of Gunther's description of passive resistance to include a consideration of these kinds of experiences and how we might trace their structural and historical roots to better understand how other animals communicate their needs in these circumstances. And I think this is really important for us, for those of us here today who are interested in and invested in imagining liberational futures for other animals. So, like, what are the structural roots of this passivity, especially for those other animals whose biological, ancestral and relational histories converge into a path of passive forms of resistance, like I see in the greyhounds leaving the racing industry? And I'd like to propose 3 structural barriers and apply these to the greyhounds that I've encountered. So again, this is very exploratory, and I'd really invite your feedback on this at the end. But firstly, I think we have to consider resistance in the context of domestication, or as Herbert has described it, domesticration. So the systemic practice of violence in which social animals enslaved and biologically manipulated resulting in their objectification, subordination and oppression. And, this concept is really important and a really foundational principle for my research, given that greyhounds have been subjected to almost 100 years of co-option and violence through commercial racing. And what we see through domestication, and we see this obviously with farmed animals, but particularly animals leaving the other animal use industries, including greyhound racing and horse racing, is that domestication effectively de-individuates animals so that they become replaceable aggregates of each other. And as I say, we really see this in industrialized farming, but also in commercial greyhound racing. So that's the kind of first structural barrier that I think we really need to consider in terms of understanding resistance. Secondly is selective breeding practices. And if in terms of greyhounds, we've selectively bred for amplified chase drive, but we've also bred for biddable dogs and dogs who are habituated to boredom. And that's really, really important in terms of understanding resistance. So a number of investigative reports, including those by Dogs Trust and League Against Cruel Sports in the UK, found that racing greyhounds typically spend upwards of 23 hours a day locked away in their kennels doing very little. And this actually provides a really important structural context for the lazy greyhound trope, which I'll come on to shortly. One of my research participants summed up what they saw as the dichotomous existence of the racing greyhound. And they said, we've messed with the software of these dogs. They're either on, as in they're racing, or they're off, they're doing nothing. There really is no middle ground. And then the third structural barrier that I'd like to invite into this discussion is the raft of greyhound mythologies which circulate across greyhound adoption spaces. And this has been a large part of what I focused on, again, in my research. Anyone who's met a greyhound in person will likely recount a version of this trope, lazy, calm, gentle, easy dogs. And the truth is, that many of these dogs do exhibit really curious behaviours that seem to set them apart from other dog breeds. What's missing, however, is a proper structural examination of this. The dog laid down in the middle of the busy street here on the right-hand side was at a charity street fundraising event that I attended for my research. And his behaviour was described to me by his caregiver on account of his laziness. And we really see this lazy, calm, gentle greyhound trope perpetuating this myth. But this is really problematic because it really doesn't allow for the consideration of other possibilities for these kinds of behaviours. I don't know whether you can see this from this image, but note here, for example, that this dog's eyes are open and the gaze is fixed. And this is a really important consideration when trying to understand what's going on for this dog. And if we come back to the image of Jacob that I put in the first slide, and we compare these two dogs here, we can see some of the similarities. Yes, both dogs are reclined, but are they relaxed and at ease? Well, possibly not. Again, note the fixed stare of the eyes in both positions, in both dogs. And my colleague Emily Stone at Exeter has done some work on this in relation to the cat fancy. She did a multi-species ethnography for a PhD looking at cat shows. And she noted what she described as sham sleeping, which is where cats seem to be, were observed sort of, seem to be resting. But she really noted the coiled position of these cats and how they seem to be prepared to leap away at, at any given opportunity. But sham sleeping was literally pretending to sleep. And I think sometimes we really just need to look a little bit closer at what we're seeing. So a question for us to consider is, you know, how do these oppressive practices of domestication, selective breeding, and greyhound mythologies, how do they blunt but also sharpen quiet acts of greyhound resistance? Well, I think they blunt them because of the fact that they confuse some of the things that we see, and they, you know, bring us to a place where we're sometimes misrepresenting or misunderstanding some of these behavioral expressions of other animals. But they can sharpen them because if we have this kind of knowledge, then we can do something about it. And just three points to finish. What can we do as scholar activists? Well, we can really engage more fully with the full expressions of other animals and notice, you know, the different ways that they participate and engage and resist care. We can think about what it means if these animals don't appear not to resist, and then we can also work hard not to reproduce tropes which essentialize other animals and diminish their individual experiences. Thank you so much for listening, and sorry for going over time.